Wonder is the common human experience for everybody. So it doesn't matter what you believe, you still experience it. And even more so, you can come to common ground with the atheist astronomer who can't stop looking at the stars, or the atheist geneticist who is absolutely fascinated by how intricate, the cell is in the DNA strands. And so there's that wonder in life and in the material world that is very similar to what the philosophers experienced. With Socrates was talking about wisdom begins in wonder. Charles Darwin struggled with God his whole life. And he has writings where there's other times when he's thinking there must have been a creator. And then he's looking at evolution. It looks so random. There could never be a creator. He's back and forth, but he's kind of more on the side of science. And then Martin Luther calls reason sort of the devil's whore. And so he's really struggling with reason. And so people thought he was anti-science, but there's other places where he speaks highly of botany and astronomy as showing glory to God. So everybody kind of struggles with this, and that's what I was trying to illustrate. What I don't want is people to feel forced to choose one or the other. And I want us to live in that tension between the two.
Welcome to Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions, the podcast where real life meets big dreams. I'm Johanna, your host, and every episode will dive into inspiring stories from PAs, doctors, and professionals who are also dreamers and mission-driven changemakers. From the hospital halls to the hearts of our homes, and even into communities across the world, we'll laugh, learn, and uncover the challenges, triumphs, and everything in between as we see life through each other's perspectives. Looking for more joy and balance in your career? Don't miss our free guide, How to Be a Fulfilled Provider. Your quick boost of encouragement with tips to help you thrive while juggling all your hats you wear. And if you've got little dreamers at home, check out Little Evie's Big Dreams on Amazon. These stories are meant to spark imagination, courage, and kindness, perfect for bedtime or anytime. Follow along as Evie, a little Sri Lankan girl, brings joy and creativity to her community while daring to dream big. This podcast is also brought to you with love by the Ephraim Foundation International, because empowering children and families in rural Sri Lanka isn't just charity, it's continuing a legacy of hope and creating futures full of possibility. So grab your cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and get ready for uplifting conversations that will leave you inspired and equipped to make a greater impact. Let's jump in. Welcome back to Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions. I'm your host, Johanna, and today we're diving into one of my favorite kind of conversations, the one that makes us stop, look up at the stars, and remember just how big and beautiful God's world really is. My guest is Brian Cranley. He is a biomedical engineer, theologian, and author of a new book called The Call of Wonder: How the God of Reason Created Science in His Image. In his work, Brian brings together the precision of science and the depth of faith to show us how reason, discovery, and scripture all point toward the same truth, the rational image of a God who invites us into authentic wonder. From the Big Bang to the human mind, we'll explore how faith and science can coexist without conflict instead of opening us to awe, curiosity, and worship. Whether you're a scientist, a person of faith, or someone who loves big questions about life and the universe, this conversation is going to invite you to rediscover the beauty of wonder and how reason and faith together illuminate the mysteries of our world. So thank you so much, Brian, for coming on the podcast today. I'm really excited about this book and this conversation.
Johanna, thanks for having me. And I love that intro. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's really great. You provide such a philosophical conversation and background to this thought of, is science a dichotomy from faith? Can they coexist? But how did your personal experience lead you to even come to these thought processes or questions? And, tell us a little bit about your journey so far.
Yeah, well, I guess I grew up in a pretty devout Christian household, like a lot of people, and I think just from reading the Bible and Genesis and going to Sunday school, I had the general idea that God created man and woman in a garden in 6 days. And he was an old man floating around up in the clouds. And then I guess when I got a little older, I have a natural tendency towards science. And I really just enjoy physics and math and biology. And so I had a natural affinity to those things. And I remember when the Hubble telescope was starting to put out its images of deep space, that really just kind of blew my mind. And I
Mm.
remember feeling that, wow, what that universe is so big and it's so beautiful and crazy. But for me, it was kind of difficult to reconcile the stories from scripture with what we're discovering about the universe and the origins of possible evolution, that man came from the primate line, and those really difficult questions. And I guess I've always been wrestling with it too, and I have on the science side, I have a degree in biomedical engineering, like you talked about. And then on the theology side, I have a Master's of Divinity, which is half philosophy, half theology. And I personally never thought those degrees would go together at all until kind of one day, these big ideas kind of brought them together. And that's what started the book.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And just talking about the Hubble, telescope, and
Yeah.
we just were in Houston for, with our daughter checking out NASA, and it's just
Yeah.
was really amazing seeing. And they had those videos of the astronauts, up in space taking photos. And what was so unique was how they were explaining how what they see with their eye
Yeah.
could not be captured with any artificial camera lens, no
Oh,
matter
wow.
how good that, what they had brought up to space with them.
Yeah.
And it just speaks to just the creation or the intensity of what we can see with our eyes sometimes, but we can't capture in forms of
Yes.
lower forms, as we might talk about from uh, later with some
Little preview.
little preview, right?
It's funny. I was really super blessed to have Dr. Tom Jones, who was an astronaut who went into space, and like they had a communion service in space. And I'm so jealous of that, to see it with your own eyes, what the Earth looks
Yeah,
like from outer space, from the space station, must be pretty phenomenal.
I know. I can't imagine. If only. So, what kind of brought you to frame science as a reflection of God's image?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that's kind of what the book is kind of based on, is this idea that God wrote his image into the actual science of the universe, the Big Bang, evolution of life, and the human mind. And I kind of call those three things the miracles of science, because they still have this sort of element of mystery and unexplainability to them, even though they appear to be natural in explanation. They do have a natural sort of explanation. But, I didn't really bring them together until I watched this YouTube video from Fermilab that talked about the very beginning of the universe. Time equals 10 to the negative 43, which is, I think, as far back as we can measure, before time equals zero. That everything was this perfect unity. And the way they described it was, E equals MC squared. So energy and mass were basically the same thing, this radiation energy. And the four forces of physics were likely all one and the same thing when the conditions are that intense. We're kind of discovering from the Large Hadron Collider that the four forces of physics may have been all in one and the same thing. And so it's this idea that at the very beginning of time, everything was a perfect unity, sounded exactly like how Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas explain the image of God, the essence of God, in the doctrine of the divine simplicity, which basically says that in God, everything is exactly one and the same thing. So we say God is love and God is power, God is goodness, or God is all knowing, God is all loving, God is all powerful. But we're saying these sort of things that sound differentiated, but they say that within God, it's all the same thing. His love equals his power, equals his knowledge, equals his, everything is the same thing in God. And so the way they describe the time equals 10 to the negative 43 of the universe sounded so much like that. That's where I kind of got this aha moment that, okay, maybe God kind of stamped his image on the very beginning of the universe just to kind of put the creator's mark on it, at the
Mhm.
Big Bang. And so
Yeah.
that was kind of the aha moment that started the book, but I still go back
Mhm.
to it and get that sort of wonder, like, wow, what if you did do it that way? That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting because you're looking at it from the ancient philosophers all the way to modern Christianity in a way,
Yeah.
but tying it from those philosophical constructs that we all kind of frame science, thought, and philosophy from, right? And so, um, how would you describe the missing piece that allows both to coexist, the faith and science?
For me, it has to be the philosophy. So what
Mhm,
brought it together for me was the philosophy that underlies theology.
mhm,
And my background is Catholic theology, which is the Western Catholic tradition, which goes from Plato to Aristotle to Augustine to Aquinas. But what we learned in seminary school was Islamic theology has a similar pattern through it. Not all of Islamic theology, but there is a philosophy in Islam that stole from Plato and Aristotle and built Islamic theology upon it. And the same is true of Judaism. There were certain Jewish philosophers, and it's hard because you call them philosophers or theologians. They
mhm.
kind of get mixed, but
Yeah.
there's this underlying bed of philosophy and rational discussion about the nature of God and these proofs that God exists that underlies theology. And for me, that's kind of what I found fascinating.
Mhm.
And I find it even more fascinating that all of monotheism kind of shares these same conclusions and
Mhm.
agreements. And I think that's a pretty cool place where we can all come together, but also where we can come together with science as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because just kind of talking to, looking at reading your book,
Yeah,
and going through, you start with Plato, then Aristotle, and of course, a little bit of Socrates before that, and then
yeah,
Aquinas, and how each of those in those models of thought talked in their own way and fashion about the immovable maker or the forms. And so how, the you were bringing up Islam and Judaism
hmm,
and the monotheism. Can you describe a little bit more as to how those philosophical thoughts all go to distinctively pointing to a creator or
yeah,
a designer? Because, you also started out the thing where you talked about Charles Darwin and how Darwin, eventually said, there is no designer. How can there be a creator or a designer? He, felt like it was all evolution, right? And even when you talked about, the Reformation and Martin Luther
yeah,
Martin Luther Martin Luther, how he, had spoken about there is, um, no control in reason,
yeah. You can't
and
control reason.
you can't control reason, and how, there is a differentiation in a way, or
Hmm,
because they, were feeling that science could not go with faith, right?
hmm,
So how do you, bring all of those thoughts together? And then, since you mentioned Islam and Judaism, I want to, expound a little bit more on that, on
yeah.
how even those, point to a creator or a designer.
Yeah. So I'll basically summarize the first half of the book because I think that
Mhm,
covers those topics. And I'll kind of try to put in what I was thinking when I was writing it. But I started off with the examples of Charles Darwin and Martin Luther as examples of the struggle that we all face when we kind of hold science on one side of our brain and our faith on the other side.
mhm,
And this sort of idea that we all sort of feel forced to choose between one or the other. And I said it's never black and white. Charles Darwin struggled with God his whole life. And he has writings where, he's more agnostic, but there's other times when he's thinking there must have been a creator, and then he's looking at evolution. It looks so random. He's like, oh, there could never be a creator. He's back and forth, but he's kind of more on the side of science. And then Martin Luther calls reason sort of the devil's whore, and there's no way to sort of rein her in. And so he's really struggling with reason. And so people thought he was anti-science, but there's other places where he speaks highly of botany and astronomy as showing glory to God. So everybody kind of struggles with this, and that's what I was trying to illustrate.
mhm,
What I don't want is people to feel forced to choose one or the other. And I
mhm,
want us to live in that tension between the two. And so the way I sort of, I mean, it's not me, this is the history of Western philosophy, but Plato begins the book, in the arguments of the rational arguments for God. He begins the book because he talks about these perfect ideal forms, which is the idea that you look at a Clydesdale horse, an Arabian horse, and you see a dog. And somehow in your mind, you know that those two things are the same and the dog is different. And so it's the idea that whatever is informing your mind and forms the horse, gives it intelligibility, is Plato thought these were perfect, ideal universals that existed in this third world. Okay. And so I bring it up because we have to have the discussion of whether or not things that are non physical can exist at all. So that means, we all agree that there's something called courage. People stand up in a protest. Well, what is courage? It can only be seen in human actions. We all agree it exists, but where does it exist? And so Plato gives this idea of the universals because he starts that conversation. And so later on in history, you'll see Philo from Judaism take that idea of the forms and say, okay, they don't exist in some random third world, but they exist as the creative ideas in the mind of God. And Augustine develops that further into Christianity. And he says, these perfect, whatever they are, these perfect things that we see a tree and we know whether it's dying or it's flourishing because we're basing it on this image of the ideal. Those ideals are the creative ideas in the mind of God. And so that's kind of where the book starts. And then it goes to Aristotle and it talks about, a lot of Aristotle, I talk about causality, like the idea of a first cause and his arguments that if everything is caused from something else and nothing can cause itself and nothing can bring itself into being or set itself into motion, then if you rewind the clock infinitely, nothing can ever begin. Nothing can ever start unless there's something that stands outside of time and change that can push over the first domino, in the long line of change. And so he introduces the argument of the unmoved mover, which then Thomas Aquinas takes up into Christianity. And these are the arguments for the existence of God that many people still use today, but they came out of Greek logical thinking. And so I wanted to kind of bring that. Islam also has Averroes and Avicenna who were strong into Aristotle and really liked his arguments and based the theology of Allah on that. And it's, Aquinas talks about a lot of their arguments. And so it's sort of like this interfaith dialogue going on, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, it is really interesting, you know, how, just speaking to the basis of just faiths in general and
Yeah.
how um, the I guess, each faith, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, so different in a way, but yet so similar in how we do all point to a creator and have faith in a higher being, right?
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting how we all believe that. But do you feel that I had a question here I wanted
Yeah.
to speak to, like, where with all these different similar but distinct understandings of the creator, but how does this shared foundation ultimately point to Jesus as the fullness of God's revelation? I know, there is, the reference to logos, but does that incorporate the word of God as Jesus or the fullness of God?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that aspect of Christianity versus the differences from Islam and Judaism?
Yeah. Yeah. So I could say that Yahweh and God the Father, or maybe the Trinity as a whole, and
Mhm,
Allah share these sort of philosophical attributes of God. They all have this in common. God is one, perfectly indivisible. He's eternal, exists outside of time and change. He's infinite, which means unbounded in any
mhm,
way in his power and knowledge. And he's a mystery, meaning he can be known to a degree through the revelation that he gives us and through natural reasoning, but there's a limit. And so the mystery of God is sort of this eternal unfolding where you constantly figure out more, but you never reach the end.
mhm,
And those attributes we all agree on. We all say that is God, he is one.
mhm,
And, the Jews are still waiting for their Messiah to come. Christians believe the Messiah has come in Jesus and he will come a second time. And Islam believes in the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad as the final perfect revelation. And they believe Jesus was a respected prophet, but not like a son of God. And so there we differ in our theologies and after what God reveals to us, we agree in what God's essence is, but not in our theologies and what he's revealed. For me personally, I believe in Christianity. And after writing the book, I believe in it even more now because the way I talk about the miracles of science, which is the Big Bang, abiogenesis, which is the idea that life comes from non life, and the human mind, which is I believe a human soul placed in the primate line after evolution prepared the body after millions of years. So these three miracles, they have this characteristic of being these profound mysteries that sort of take reality up a level. So you have in the Big Bang, you have nothing and then you have matter. And in abiogenesis, you have matter and then you have life. And then in the human mind, you have life and then the immortal soul. And then, I would say in the virgin birth of Jesus, you have the human soul that gives birth to God. And so it kind of completes the cycle. But what I wrote about in my book is that if you look at the miracles of Jesus, he does this same sort of thing. He will always use something natural to enact the supernatural. And so he's always like he wipes mud on the man's eyes to heal the blindness, and he baptizes with actual water. He turns bread into his body, wine into his blood. He's always using some natural element to enact a miracle. And I feel like what he's doing is he's reminding us the refrain of Genesis where God is saying, hey, remember all this stuff I created? This is good. This is very good. And so Jesus is using that created stuff to enact his miracles. And what I say in the book is this is exactly what the miracles of science look like. They use the created world, they appear natural, but there's this supernatural element to them. And the miracles are right around us. You look outside, you're living in a living miracle. Every moment is sustained by God and planned out over this billion-year process, which I find even more fascinating. So yeah, I think Christianity, I believe in it even more after writing the book, but I still love that, monotheism shares the essence of God in common, that we share that together.
Yeah, it is interesting when you think of these philosophers, and think of how they had, come up with these thought processes not based on, the Bible or Christianity as what we know of it today, but, looking at Aquinas's teachings on, as you were saying, God as one, infinite, unknowable, non physical. And thinking of, even Plato when he was, coming, that image of
Yeah,
coming out of the cave and from the darkness to the light. We're constantly looking towards that, even though there's a tension, there's a difficulty sometimes in trying to move from that darkness to light. And then that movement of the actuality of potentiality,
you
and,
got it.
you think you think of these thought processes,
It's
and
unbelievable.
when I was looking at it and I was trying to read and think of these Bible verses that kind of like reference and speak to these thought processes where, like Ephesians 5:13, everything exposed by light becomes visible. Hebrews, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible, because in these
I love that.
philosophical discussions, it's all about, thought. And, we can't see sometimes the things that are higher forms or more valuable than what is physical, right?
Yeah.
But yet, and then as you said, this creation and all around us, sometimes what we may see with our eyes, what we may feel on our five senses, it's more than just something that is in like I can't express it other than that lower form that, because that's in my thought process right now, of
Yeah.
that, and so it's really interesting to think of it like that. Um,
I
you know,
agree. 100%. I
and
remember sitting in class thinking when they taught me what Plato said about the form of the good and we read the allegory in the cave, like you're talking about right there.
Mhm,
I just remember thinking, like, how did he not have access to a Bible? And how is he not like thinking of the God of monotheism?
mhm,
And the idea is most likely he didn't have access to the Jewish scriptures. He might have, but this stuff they came up with on their own with rational thought. And it just
right.
blew my mind that they didn't get, everything right. They didn't get half
Right.
of it right, maybe. But the
Mhm,
fact that they got as far as they did with rational thought, human reasoning debate, just
mhm.
unbelievable. Yeah, it sounds so much like the God we talk about today.
Yeah, and in a way, that's what science is all about too, right? Is hypotheses that we're constantly questioning and trying to answer, um, through reason, but also through experimental designs, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And in that same way, we see a physical response or some sort of actuality that, outcome.
Mhm.
But it's interesting how why can't we see that in the same way as faith, right? Faith in the same way is kind of just in my own words maybe, seeing something that you can't see with a physical sense of thing. It's a hypothesis, it's a way of thinking, it's a belief system. You try to prove it with your um reasoning,
Yep.
and understanding of what you have before you, and what is surrounding us, which is the world we live in. Um, going to some of your, the awe and wonder of that you describe in your book, and that's the whole point of it, is how do you not reconcile that there could be a great designer, the world that
Yeah.
surrounds us, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I was going to say, I like that idea that faith, you can still do sort of experiments with faith, not like scientific in the sense that you're measuring, but you can still, and just for instance, after writing this book, my personal wonder has like exponentially increased. And so I thought, as I was writing, wow, you can think about these mysteries the rest of your life and never sort of, okay, I figured it out.
Yeah.
And you never reach that completion. It's almost like this endless source of fascination and I don't know, somehow it's life giving. And so I would encourage anybody that's considering reading the book or something like that, see if that happens for you. When you start thinking about these mysteries of science and the mysteries of faith, does your wonder increase? And do you find that sort of endless source? Because I think it's not scientific in a sense, but it's still an experiment you can run on your own personal experience.
Yeah, because life is going to be full of ups and downs and
Hmm.
different seasons and different things that we go through that will challenge our faith, right?
Yeah.
And so, as we get challenged in our faith, we either do two things. We either increase in our faith or decrease, right? Based
Right.
on what our outcomes are and our perspective and our reasoning of that challenge or life's event, right?
Hmm.
And so, in a way, we're constantly having a discussion internally of,
Yeah.
where is our faith? How do we believe in God despite this diagnosis? How do we believe in God despite this thing happening, or loss, or grief, or sorrow, or world events?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a constant, also not experiment, but a constant learning experience or reasoning that we're also internally having to reason with ourselves and trust ultimately in.
Yeah. And I think another thing that writing the book did for me, and I want it to do for my readers, is
Mhm.
I think a lot of believers carry a sort of silent fear that if I look into science too far, or if I'm so excited about science that somehow I'm offending God, or that I'll find something in science that will finally discount my faith. And I'll reach that point where I can no longer believe. I think there's a silent fear, and maybe it's conscious or not. But one thing I've discovered after like really trying to research the science as much as I could is science hits these points where it can't go any further. The time equals zero. It just can't go there. And abiogenesis, we still can't create a living cell in our labs. We're trying really hard. We feel like we know, the conditions of the universe at the time the first cell came into existence, but we can't do it in a lab. And we can't figure out our own human mind, which is so near and dear to every one of us. We still don't know, no matter how much biology, psychology, neurology we study, we still don't know how the human mind works and
Mhm.
consciousness. And those three places, you hit this wall of mystery. And my point in the book is that that is exactly God's image. When you go meet God, you hit this fascinating wall of unknowing, and that's sort of like one of his characteristics. And so I feel like I've gotten a personal freedom from researching the science that far, knowing that
Mm.
it does have these limits you'll hit, and
Yeah.
I'm no longer scared that I'm going to find something that'll break my faith.
Mm.
Instead, it's absolutely done the opposite and built it up tremendously. So I hope to share that with readers as well.
Yeah, I love that. That is so true, is a freedom from fearing what would break your faith when
Yeah.
you come to that point of understanding that there are some things you'll never understand or be able to reason. You
Yeah.
just have to trust,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Yeah. And wanted to just also ask, like, could you explain how the Big Bang, evolution, and the human mind serve as divine revelations in your framework?
Hmm. Yeah. So in philosophy that we talked about, like these ideas of
Mhm.
the unmoved mover and Plato's highest good, the form of the good. they arrive at these divine attributes. Like, if God is this, then God must be this. And they're very
Mhm.
logical. And so one is God is indivisible. He can't have any parts. You can't divide him up in any possible way. And that's where I said his love is his power, is his knowledge. They're all equal. And so then after that, he must be outside of all time and change. He cannot be inside of time at all. And so that's where you get the idea of eternal. Without change means you, by definition, have to exist outside of time, which Aristotle defines time as a measure of change. So if there is no change in this being, he must logically exist outside of time. Then you have unbounded. He can't be limited in any way, or whatever he's limited by would be a defect in him and something that is a potential to be actualized. And so in God, he is non finite and unbounded. And that's where we get the idea of infinite. And
Mhm.
so, and last is that idea of mystery, right? He is
Mhm.
unknowable because it's like a dog trying to figure out humanity, and he's on an infinitely higher plane of being than us. And so we can know that he exists. We can know something about him. We can know what he tells us from divine revelation, but we can never figure out what God is like completely, because then you would have to be equal to God. And so these four, and non-physical, we talk about non-physical. So those five attributes, I try to show how the science contains those exact same attributes, not perfectly because they're not God, but they're analogies or these images of God. And so in the Big Bang, you have time equals 10 to the negative 43, perfect unity. And so God is one and indivisible. It's now exploding, expanding out towards infinite size. And the edges of the universe are expanding faster than the speed of light can travel, which is just mind blowing, and have been doing it for 13.8 billion years. So it is moving towards infinity. As we speak, it's growing towards infinity. And I talk about how it's sort of this endless quest that it'll never reach the end of. And so it's exhibiting God's infinity, even though it'll never get there. The fact that it's 13.8 billion years, I talk about how God is outside of time. And so he starts this process, 13.8 billion years ago with the plan of humanity in mind. And although it's an unfathomably long time for us, it's outside of time for God. And so he's seeing all these moments simultaneously. And so it has this sort of attribute of eternity. And then mystery, in the universe, we'll never see outside the observable universe. That just blows my mind that there's all this universe you'll never see. And that's exactly how God is. You can see some of him, but you can't see the rest, but it's there. And at the Big Bang time equals zero, our science breaks down, our current science. And so we'll never see into that moment. And that is, to me, sort of God's image written all over it. And I do the same thing with life, starting from, single cells and evolving out into this. It's not an infinite diversity, but as it moves towards diversity, that's what gives us the wonder of nature, is when you see all this diverse, beautiful life, plants and animals. And when you see that landscape full of life, that's what gives you the wonder. And my argument is because that's imaging God's infinity. It's heading towards that direction, although it will never get there. And then in the human mind, I talk about the mind at rest. The ancient philosophers used to call the tabula rasa, which meant blank slate, because the ancients used to write on these wax tablets and they would impress them, with a stylus, and then erase them, smother them out. And that's how they would explain the human mind, that the mind at rest is this perfect non-physical unity with the potentiality to become any thought you put into it. So it's kind of like a big bang. Every time you start a thought process, you start at rest with perfect unity, and then your mind moves out towards literally an infinite number of thoughts. You can think about anything. And, we go through some of those thought experiences and processes in the book. But the mind, images God almost more than the universe and life does. And so he created us in his image. And that is one of the defining characteristics in my mind, is that we bear the divine attributes in our rational capacity.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you're talking, the question in my mind is like, how does one become agnostic when you think of these things? How did
Yeah,
you, how do you rationale that?
I do. So I study atheism all the time. I love
Mhm.
it. I just like the arguments.
Yeah.
And as a believer, I have to acknowledge that atheist or agnostic arguments are also rational and they carry weight. And the best atheists I've talked to have to agree that believers' arguments, like the ones I'm talking about, they've all heard them from Aristotle and Aquinas. Those
Yeah.
are rational and they carry weight. And so the reason why I present them all in the book is so that we can all meet at a level playing field. And we can both say, hey, our arguments are rational. So the atheist main two arguments are the problem of evil and suffering
Hmm.
and the appearance of a natural cause of everything. You know,
Hmm.
the Big Bang just happened into a negatively charged empty space, or life just assembled itself. It looks to the human eye as natural. And so as a believer, I say I get those. The problem of evil and suffering is very difficult for
Hmm.
everyone to answer.
Yeah.
And so I think I was going with that, but I think that it's a conversation that when you get on the same level playing ground, oh, I know what I was going to say. I don't think anybody makes their choice for belief or agnosticism based on rational ideas. This is just after writing the book. I've been studying a lot of people and listening to their stories. There
Hmm.
is some personal experience that either puts you over the edge towards God or you feel like he wasn't there when you called on him and he must not exist. And that's what I think is the final decider. But I want my book to get everyone to this place where you can make your own decision and not for people to have the excuse that
Hmm.
I'm agnostic, I don't know, and I'm just never going to think about it. I think that's just a lazy way out. So I think it's a personal experience decision in the end, but the ideas are still fascinating.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was trying to also talk about earlier is, when you face challenges, when you come to certain difficulties in your life, which is, the suffering that you might see in the world or
Yeah.
in your own life, you choose what you believe in, right? And whether to proceed in faith in a God that you can trust or anger at a God who failed you. And but I was listening to somebody about how um, the world today, sometimes we're losing that purpose and that beauty of meaning in life. And that has kind of created maybe through our dependency on technology or different things where we kind of have become less motivated to have these purpose or meaning that drives our passions or purpose, career choices or decisions in life. And as I was reading your book, um, you know, going back to the allegory of the cave, it moving from shadows into light, it connects in a way that biblical picture of God bringing truth into light. And I feel like, that faith in God also helps us keep that purpose. Sometimes, people are talking about, people not having purpose or meaning or losing that value or understanding of it because of just dependency on technology or just, social media or, just the loss of wonder and awe in just being able to enjoy the simple meaning in life. And faith, I feel like, kind of brings that back to us because we live with a purpose to please God in a way, not kind of just, pleasing God, but live a life that is worthy of the calling that we have on us, right? And I think that helps us keep moving forward that, potentiality, that, purpose that
Actualize,
is
yeah.
actualizing that thing that the philosophers of old, were talking about. But I feel like that faith in Christ, kind of really brings all that together and keeps us having that. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I think you have to have a purpose and you have to have meaning in your own personal life. Viktor Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning was really big on this one for me. So is Simon Sinek's book Start with Why. With that idea that what am I supposed to be doing with my life? And does my life have any consequence past just being materialist and I die and I turn into nutrients for plants?
Right.
That's what the materialist atheist tries to uphold as their meaning. Or, you get a lot of these guys that are atheists, but they're still talking about the virtues, like human virtues and being a good human.
Mhm.
I think you need to find all that. And there's this sort of general goodness. You can be a good person, general meaning we can all live towards. But I think what faith brings in is what is Johanna's particular purpose in this world? What am I calling Brian Cranley to do with his life? That's a whole different question. And that's what really, like you said, like just gets people motivated to live a
Mhm.
life beyond themselves when the calling is particular to you. So I think that's a good point. Yeah. And there's a lot of wonder in that as well. Just thinking that there is a God and that maybe he's asking me to do something specific with my life. And then I would say if you start doing that thing and you feel the presence and the power behind it, that is absolutely fascinating. And you'll definitely want more of that.
Yeah. It also kind of takes the pressure off of us too, because if you're thinking, okay, I'm a good person,
Yeah,
and but if I do something bad, then I failed as a good person, and then I have to start over again. That pressure to be good is always there. And then if we fail, then we're like, well, then there's no point being good. We're just bad. I don't know. I feel like we can get into that kind of thought process and tumble down.
sure.
But that point of like, are we good people? Maybe, there's a goodness, but then that brings into that faith aspect that we are all sinners,
Yeah,
falling short
that's
for
where
the glory of God. That
Christian
Christian belief, yeah.
theology in particular really comes in very powerful there, where
Because
Jesus
it
is
yeah, yeah, it brings us to have less of an identity in our own goodness, because
right.
that can lead to our own failures and inability to overcome if we're constantly looking at our own self and
Yeah.
failures and trying to do it on our own, then having that faith in Christ to give us that strength to move forward. But how that may feel like a crutch to some people. But how would you phrase that? So that how would you put that in a context where you don't feel like it's a crutch, but it's something that you actually can live purposely by?
Well, I think you're actually getting into the topic of my third book that I have planned. My third book, I want to talk about a meditation on power, the idea,
Mhm,
and a meditation on Christ's life, the life of Christ. Because if you think about what did he actually do when he
mhm.
came to Earth, we don't even know the first 30 years. I mean, we know a little bit about his childhood, but he lived
Right.
a normal life. He was a carpenter, so he did some manual labor.
Mhm,
And then his ministry was 3 years of walking around a relatively small region, preaching, doing miracles. But the American ideal is this hyper productivity, like just
mhm.
you got to pump out whatever your job is nonstop. And if you're an awesome person, you can pump out 120% productivity in a day.
Yeah,
It's this
yeah.
idea that the more I do, the more value
Mhm.
I have.
Right.
And I want to sort of combat that with, Christ, because I think he was so intimately tied to the Father and he had this just power about him, this presence.
Mhm,
He didn't have to do a lot. He didn't have to say a lot. It was who he was that was the
mhm,
power. And so I'm sure if you just came into his presence, you are changed
mhm.
immediately. So yeah, I want to write a book about that idea of power and purpose and
Mhm.
probably doing less for a lot of people. I think a lot of people are in the American addiction of just doing more, more, more nonstop.
Yes.
And everyone's exhausted. Everyone is so tired. So anyway, sorry,
Yeah.
it's a different
Yeah.
book for another day.
That is a different soapbox for another day, but that is so true because we are all on a, rat race to nowhere.
Yeah, we are, myself included. I mean, I'm preaching myself when I say
I
all this
know,
stuff.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so one more I wanted to really talk about, and bring back that wonder
Yeah.
was you categorize 3 types of wonder: cheap, imaginative, and authentic. Can you elaborate on the importance of authentic wonder?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. So I was trying to just think to myself, what is this experience that I'm trying to describe? So you look up at the starry sky, or you look at the images from the James Webb Telescope now, or even the beauty of whatever, you're on a walk, you look at the trees, the flowers. What is that experience or the ocean that humbles you and that gives you perspective almost immediately? It takes you outside yourself. And so I call that authentic wonder, which is the idea that you make yourself present to these larger realities that are outside of you. And that's sort of what I said I want more of now. That's the wonder I'm after. And I contrast that with the cheap wonder, which is, social media hooks. They call them hooks and
Mhm,
thumbnails, where you're trying to put, you know, an emotional reaction into the title and the picture so that someone
mhm,
stops scrolling. The problem is when everybody does that to compete with each other, it just gets more sensationalist, sensationalist, sensationalist. So by the time you're done scrolling for the night, you're more exhausted than when you started. Or a CGI movie I talk about where, now if you watch a Transformers movie for 3 hours, it's just, you are bombarded by computer generated action for 3 hours straight. I don't even like them anymore, I'm honest. with you. I like, some superhero movies, but just pure
Yeah,
CGI the whole time is like, it's too
yeah.
much. I don't like it.
It's not real.
It's not real, and it's actually, like, stressful. I don't know, it's like a seizure. So, and then the other kind is imaginative wonder, which is a good thing, but I say kind of like, used with temperance. So, kids use imagination to dream up story time, whatever. Adults use imagination to picture a life that they want, which is a good tool. But
Mhm,
then I say if you get lost in imagination and you become the dreamer that never takes one action step to pursue the life you want, or you're
mhm,
lost in memory of the glory days, you're sort of
mhm,
lost in imagination.
mhm,
That type of wonder can be a tool, but I that's not the type of like fulfilling wonder I want anymore. So that's
mhm,
where I talk about this authentic wonder, which the book tries to, give people experiences of
mhm.
different places that I found them. So,
Yeah, and so it's kind of goes back to even what we were talking about before, like, that constant rat race,
yeah,
it's stopping, calming, and just focusing on the beauty and the simple things that create that and that exclamation of not just wow, but like makes you exhale in a peaceful manner and be like, like looking around and I want to just say, sunset or the walk or
yeah,
those simple moments that make you kind of realize where you are in creation, right?
yeah, and
And that yeah.
yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
And that takes rest, and that takes stopping to focus, right?
It does, and it's scary for most of us when you're running 100 miles an hour throughout the
Mhm.
day, and like you said, I love the daily walk idea. You go for a daily walk, and your mind stops if you are walking without earbuds in and music and podcasts and everything. If you can actually take a walk with nothing in
Yeah,
your ears, then it's
right.
sometimes scary. Like, you're faced with yourself, you're faced with
Mhm.
issues. Um, if you press through it, I think that's where the gold is.
Yeah, yeah. And so you include fables at the start of each chapter. How do they enhance the reader's experience just so that the readers have a taste of what your book is like?
Yeah,
And I
so
I
at the
loved how sorry, I loved
Go
how
ahead.
the persona of a Sophia as a
Yeah?
guide. That was a
Yeah.
nice thing.
Thank you. So, it's funny because that literary device has been used before,
Yeah.
and that same sort of character, I found out later, has been used, but Sophia just means wisdom, and
Mhm.
it's sort of the personification of divine wisdom, and she
Yeah.
guides you on these journeys with a little fable before each chapter, and I did that because I'm a big experience guy. And
Mhm.
I was pretty aware that some of these chapters get pretty dense and we get into some real philosophy and some real
Yeah.
theology and real science.
Mm,
So I wanted to have a story that sort of set the tone. And,
mhm,
she's taking you through these sometimes ancient locations where the chapter's about to take place, but also what I really wanted to communicate was how it feels to experience wonder in these different fields in science, philosophy, and theology. Because, I felt that way when I was learning all these things, but I didn't put them all together, until 20, 30 years later. But as I
mhm,
was learning them, there was sort of like you felt like you're being led, or you feel like, someone's reaching out to you and you're responding, and not necessarily
mhm.
like I'm discovering all this stuff myself. It
Yeah.
feels like a gift, it feels like you're getting in that treasure. So I wanted to sort of communicate that idea in the fables, but some people like
Mhm.
them, some people could leave them. I've had literally mixed reviews on them, but I love them.
Yeah, it's nice, it's nice. I enjoyed it, reading your book, and that kinda made it a little unique as well.
Yeah,
Broke up the intense,
the heavy.
heavy, but yeah, but it's always good, yeah. And so, how does scripture reflect the same rational image of God revealed through science?
Great question. Yeah, so the scriptures, what we're mostly referring to is Genesis 1 and 2, the first two creation accounts.
Mhm,
There are a lot of other places that refer to creation, but I just kind of, there's only so much space that you can cover. And I'm
mhm,
not like a scripture scholar by any means, but what I wanted to do there was talk about in the first creation account, the 7-day creation, the authors use different words for create. That there's the word bara, B A R A, which is what we think of when God creates ex nihilo, from nothing. So it's the idea of divine creation from nothing. It just happens. And then there's Badal, and I think it's Asha, something like that. And those two mean more to fashion from materials already present or to divide and separate out. I think Badal means separate out. And so in the beginning, Genesis 1:1 talks about, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he uses the word bara. So God creates heavens and earth in the ancient Mesopotamian time meant everything we know. Now, everything up there, everything on the ground, everything we know was created by God. And that was in itself a really big statement. The ancients said, hey, the universe has a beginning, and not all tribes and peoples believed that before. And they all believed in many gods. And this, specific tribe said, no, there's one God. He created, and there was a beginning. And those are massive theological statements that we take for granted now because we've inherited those through our lifetime. But those were massive theological statements back then. But then what's fascinating is, you say, he said, let there be light. He didn't create bara, light from nothing. He says, let there be light. He separates light from darkness. He separates water from land. And he goes through this symphony of separation I talk about. He does return to the word bara 2 other times. This gave me chills. I didn't write this in the book, but it gives me chills now. First bara is create everything, heavens and earth. Second bara is these sea monsters and animals. Okay. And the third bara, it's used 3 times in reference to humanity. So he creates from nothing. He creates the sea creatures and the animals, and he creates man in his image. And the 3 miracles of science are the Big Bang from nothing, abiogenesis in the sea, which led to the sea life and animals, and man and woman from the primate line. And so it's almost as if Genesis only reserves that word creation from nothing for these science miracles, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So I wrote most of that in the book, but not quite in that much detail.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's really interesting to think of it like that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Oh, that's profound. Yeah. And do you view rational wonder as a universal bridge across faith traditions?
100%. And I would say what I'm trying to do is use it as a universal bridge, gathering all the faith traditions together to bridge it with agnosticism and materialist science. Yes, wonder is the common human experience for everybody. So it doesn't matter what you believe, you still experience it.
Yeah.
But we can also kind of come to a common ground with other faiths. And even more so, you can come to common ground with the atheist astronomer who can't stop looking at the stars, or the atheist geneticist who is absolutely fascinated by how intricate, the cell is in the DNA strands. And so there's that wonder in life and in the material world that is very similar to what the philosophers experienced with Socrates was talking about. Wisdom begins in wonder. He meant like philosophical curiosity and searching for the truth. But it's the same wonder that the theologians find when they encounter God and, try to describe him in these rational terms. And yeah, it's the common human experience that everyone shares. And I think we need more of it as well. It's also the cure for modern humanity in some sense, for mental health. So I think it's a great catch-all phrase.
It is, yeah, and that's what I love about bringing you on the podcast to talk about your book because I think we all could, stop and wonder and
Yeah.
appreciate the wonder of the creation around us and just, understand that, there is something greater to believe in and hope, right? It brings a hope into humanity. But sometimes I feel like, or do you feel like that there is starting to be a dichotomy being introduced again to divide faith and science in the current?
Like a new dichotomy, there's definitely new efforts, which is why I tried to write this book. I mean, there's definitely the new atheist movement, which is, it's the same arguments that is brought up over and over and over. And so there's new energy put into it. But what's great about the internet, on a side note, is that it really does, besides a lot of misinformation, it does conglomerate all of human knowledge in one place.
Yeah.
So if you want to find out about what the science really says, you can watch 4,000 videos on it and kind of make a decision for yourself.
Yeah.
And so we all are coming to an equal footing place where you can watch or read, the best of every field and come to your own conclusion. So yeah, there is a lot of energy that tries to say the new science is somehow disproves God, but I find the exact opposite to be true. And so I hope with this book to kind of join that discussion, the modern discussion, for sure.
Yeah. And one last word on how you envision this book influencing this, conversation of having faith and science coexist and what that means to you.
Yeah. I recently read a review that said it challenges both sides of the argument. The book challenges both sides. And that's what I hope to do. First of all, the first half of the book, I hope to provide every reader with a summary of the education that I got, which was from Plato to Aquinas and the Muslim thinkers and the Jewish thinkers. And so in 4 chapters, you get caught up on the discussion from 2,000 years ago. And I just think that's valuable just for anybody to know that argument, whether you believe it or not. And then, the second part is more sort of speculative thinking on science and did God write his image? But what I'm hoping for people to get is just this idea for the people of faith that there are rational arguments for God and science is safe. It's okay. It's not going to disprove your faith. And for the people on the science, maybe atheist science side, hey, there are these arguments for God that you guys still have to come up with a really good defense against, that we're on an equal playing field when it comes to reason. They might not agree with that, but the major consensus is. And so this book is just trying to catch people up on that discussion so that they can make their own decisions, but also just to know this conversation has been going on for thousands of years. I know it's not going to stop anytime soon, but it's fascinating to be a part of.
Yeah. And one last sentence about wonder that you want to encourage others about.
I think anytime you experience authentic wonder, you're seeing some attribute of God that he is trying to reveal to you. And I want to go into this more about, how the starry sky is the image of God's infinity and eternity. And you're looking at it and it's a picture of him. And that is why you feel wonder. But I got to keep working on that. So I'll get back to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for joining me today. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that it just, just like you wanted to envision for your book, I hope it just makes people think, make people have conversations and discuss these beautiful topics that make us human,
Amen.
right?
Thank
And
you so much for having me.
yeah, of course. And I will have the book in the show notes and where to buy it, Brian's website as well. So please check it out and enjoy the read. It is a really good read, so make sure you check it out. Thanks for joining me for this inspiring conversation with Brian Cranley. I loved Brian's perspective on living in authentic wonder, not just chasing those quick excitements, but slowing down enough to let discovery lead us back to God. I hope it encouraged you to embrace wonder in both your faith and your view of science. You can find his book, The Call of Wonder, linked on the show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend, leave a review, subscribe, follow, comment. Until next time, may you step into the week with eyes wide open to the beauty of God's creation. Keep living with hope, faith, and wonder. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions. We hope you found inspiration, insight, and a sense of connection in the stories we shared today. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram for updates, free downloads, and join a community of like-minded individuals passionate about making a difference through medicine, motherhood, and mission work. Remember, you're not alone in this journey. Until next time, keep sparking hope, keep healing, keep nurturing, and keep making a difference. This is Johanna signing off from Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions. The medical opinions expressed on this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be considered as medical advice. Always consult a licensed healthcare provider for personal medical concerns or questions. The views expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the podcast host.